Intermittent fasting has been a really popular intervention lately because it's been shown to enhance weight loss without having to really tightly regulate and count for calories. It's been shown to decrease glycemic excursions and improve glycemic variability. It's been shown to improve insulin sensitivity. It's also been shown to support various aspects linked with longevity, such as the process of autophagy and decreasing mTOR. Now, it turns out that a specific subtype of intermittent fasting, known as time-restricted feeding, may actually help to support processes linked with longevity, such as autophagy, and enhance weight loss due to its rather strict focus more on matching day and dark cycles, light and dark cycles, and syncing your body's circadian clock system with your metabolism. And so this is a really important thing to really focus on because many people get oftentimes hung up on the number of hours they fast without really considering when they're breaking their fast or when they're starting their fast and when they're refeeding versus cutting off their feeding window and how that matches with the natural light and dark cycles throughout the day and the circadian clock system. Because a series of new studies that we're going to unpack today have really eloquently illustrated that your body's metabolism and the processes linked with longevity are impossible to disentangle from your body's circadian clock system. So throughout this conversation and throughout this research study review that we're going to do in today's session, I want you to more focus on when you're breaking your fast or starting your fast, the time of day, not so much the hours fasted. Because what a series of studies have actually found is that when the circadian clock system is augmented, even if people are fasting, well, at least this is actually done in animals, but there's a proof of concept studies found that the circadian clock system is necessary to upregulate the autophagy related processes that are increased when we are fasting and undergoing intermittent fasting. So without that circadian clock, sort of entrainment or influence, the autophagy and their various longevity related pathways that are increased as a result of fasting don't actually achieve their maximum health benefits. So that's sort of the take-home message here. Again, instead of focusing on 18 hours fasted or 20 hours fasted, it's better to focus on feeding when the sun is out during the daylight and fasting during the nighttime. And this is really important as we transition away from summer into fall and into winter. We should naturally be compressing our feeding window. Now, this makes a lot of sense. If any of you have ever been out backpacking or hiking or spent time in the wilderness, you naturally do this. People naturally do this, and humans naturally do this because what happens at night? Predators are out. Apex predators like grizzly bears or mountain lions or cougars or things like that. Okay, if you're out there eating and snacking on ice cream, and you're just increasing your probability of having a lethal encounter with an animal. So we naturally do this. Now, we don't tend to think about this in our cozy homes with air conditioning and Netflix and Uber Eats being delivered in the refrigerator and all that. We don't think about that. And that's how and again, I'm going to present the argument in this session as we dive into the research, that we're living with a mismatch in terms of matching our feeding fasting patterns with our environment. And that is part of the reason why some people don't get the benefits even when they're doing quote unquote intermittent fasting. And I find this with clients all the time. They're often bookending their day with a lot of food, going to bed on a full stomach. Your body has peripheral and central circadian clock Zeitgebers. These are regulators within various tissues that help to synchronize our bodies with our environment. And when there's a mismatch, meaning that you're eating later in the day and you're not eating foods during the light cycles of the day, you cause a mismatch here, and that's where you get indigestion. That's where you get blood sugar volatility. That's where you get more inflammation. That's where you don't get the weight loss benefits that are normally ascribed to intermittent fasting. So one of the studies that we're going to dive into first, but I want to give you some background and perspective, and this was the article in Nature. It's titled Circadian Autophagy Drives Intermittent Fasting, Time-Restricted Feeding-Mediated Longevity. And so again, the short take-home message here is it's impossible to disentangle the longevity and metabolic benefits that are linked with fasting from the body's circadian clock system. They are two sides of the same coin. So just think about that. So the authors go on to say that we found that time-restricted feeding enhanced circadian rhythm regulated transcription, meaning the turning on of different genes, and that time-restricted feeding mediated lifespan extension required both circadian regulation and autophagy. So the benefits of TRF or IF depend upon the circadian clock system. So let's just back up a little bit. Let's back the truck up. We're getting way ahead of ourselves. We have a lot of background and perspective that we need to unpack so that this sort of makes sense to you. This was a phenomenal article here published in the Journal of Clinical Investigation, Interconnections Between Circadian Clocks and Metabolism, in August of this year. So the authors go on to say, emerging evidence shows that exposure to environmental stimuli such as artificial light, imbalanced diet like processed foods and hyperpalatable junk and all of that, mistimed eating. Who's guilty of this? Who's guilty of having ice cream before you go to bed? A lot of us have done that in the past. I used to do that, but I don't do that now. And exercise timing. We're going to talk a little bit more about how being more consistent with your exercise timing when you exercise, as opposed to being haphazard, may actually enhance some of the benefits. Okay, so all these factors, imbalanced diet, artificial light, mistimed eating, and so forth, remodels the circadian physiology processes and causes metabolic disorders. Okay, this review summarizes the reciprocal regulation between circadian clock system, metabolism, and highlighting remaining gaps in knowledge about the regulation of circadian rhythms and metabolism. So a lot of really good images here. If you're watching over on YouTube, you see these molecular clocks. And so again, these are influenced by peripheral, photoreceptors and temperature regulation. For example, you're colder in the morning compared to in the evening. This might be why cold showers have been shown to be effective for helping people with sleep, for example. But anyway, all these intracellular transcription factors and molecular clocks ultimately regulate the brain, the heart, the muscle, the liver, the fat cells, the pancreas, the intestines, and the immune system. Really important stuff. So these internal timekeeping systems of the circadian clock have evolved to anticipate external changes within the environment. These conserved rhythms synchronize internal biology and behavioral processes to the external temporal environment, presumably providing organisms with selective advantages for survival. As I was saying, there's apex predators that are out feeding, during the night. So if you're sitting in your tent eating Snickers bars and ice creams, in Montana or in Washington before the grizzly bears were eradicated, or California, you're putting yourself at risk for actually having a lethal encounter with an apex predator. So we would naturally not do that. You would want to go to bed. You would want to be, having your food far away from your tent or your teepee, this was several hundred years ago. But again, we're in these big, cozy homes, multiple stories. We have security, we have cameras, we have, all that. And so we don't think about, those sort of situations. So that's why I think it's great to get in touch with the environment, get your family out camping, and just by naturally being closer, to the cyclical nature of the day, the darkness, you make better decisions. And then you bring those homes with you and start to make better decisions that way. So a lot of great images here that you should check into. So what are some of the deleterious effects when it comes to the metabolism if we're having circadian misalignment, if we're having snacks when we shouldn't be, if we're, on our devices and our phones and all of that? Well, it turns out that circadian misalignment like social jet lag, shift work, sleep disorders, all of that cause abnormal glucose and lipid metabolism. It decreases insulin sensitivity. It increases inflammation and causes adverse cardiovascular consequences, heart attacks, and things like that. Imbalanced eating patterns alters plasma glucose levels, triglyceride levels, body mass index, gut hormones like GLP-1, insulin. Blood pressure is a big one. So if you ever track your blood pressure, especially after you traveled, or especially if you stay up late at night, you watch Netflix or something, your blood pressure is going to be totally skewed. And so this may be why shift workers are at a higher risk for having heart attacks and cardiovascular disease and hypertension and all of that. Body weight, even immune system cell responses, the B cells, which is a part of your adaptive immune system, free radical stressors, fat oxidation, cholesterol, and much more. So this is a great image here. We're going to talk a little bit more about some of these studies. Now, this image here, and this is from a different paper in the Endocrine Reviews, shows that, and it's just a great example. You have an overweight person on the left here. You have a lean, metabolically healthy person on the right. So what you see is the overweight person has mismatched circadian rhythms, increased fatty liver disease, decreases in insulin sensitivity, compromised sleep and quality of life, and increased risk for disease, which is not found in the other person. Now, what you see here is the green is the real open feeding window. So this is, not adhering, having a mismatched meal timing with the environment. So really important stuff here. Again, just to remind people, shift workers have compromises in dyslipidemia, changes in their blood glucose levels, insulin resistance, and much more. So there's a lot of the data there. Light is really important. So this, after reading this over the weekend as I was sort of preparing for this podcast, it reminded me of a habit that I'm really guilty of and I want to change, and that is being on my phone or my tech or any screens in the 2 hours before bed. So very short, this is what they're saying in the paper, very short exposures to nocturnal light inhibit melatonin release after clock gene expression and increase in the CFOS gene expression in the central chiasmatic nucleus, which is the central regulatory process of the circadian clock system in your hypothalamus in your brain. So this effect is wavelength dependent. Blue light has the greatest effect. So just being on your phone, checking into the weather or checking, just mindlessly scrolling on Instagram before bed is going to totally screw up your body's circadian clock system, compromise your sleep, affect your recovery, affect the next day's leptin and cortisol release and blood sugar handling. So it's not really worth it. If you're spending all this money on food, if you're trying to optimize health parameters, and then you're just sitting on your phone at night, you are literally robbing Peter to pay Paul, and it's not a good thing. Meal timing. So this is a really important thing to remember, and this is why instead of focusing on your fasting window, focus on when you eat and when you break your fast. For example, we're going to talk about some new studies in just a moment here that show that early time-restricted feeding, eating at 8 in the morning and cutting the feeding window off too, which I know that's a little bit utopian ideal. If you have kids, you're not going to be able to do that. But maybe 11 to 6, 11 to 7, or 10 to 6, something like that is much better than fasting all day and having a monster dinner and dessert and all that at 8 p.m. Okay, so meal timing is known to be a dominant Zeitgeber. Zeitgeber is an influencer on your body's circadian clock system. That's a German word for that. So this is, you have your central clock system and you have your peripheral clocks. Food hitting your GI tract influences your body's circadian clock system. So as humans, we want to eat during our active phase, which of course should be during the daytime when the sun's out. And so when we don't eat in our active phase and we eat in the dark phase, again, we are diurnal creatures, meaning that we're asleep when it's dark and we're active and awake when it's light. And so when we eat outside of those windows, we compromise our health. Now, it's also important to understand that there are additional Zeitgebers, not just meal timing, not just light, but things like including temperature. Your external temperature influences your body's peripheral circadian rhythms. So this may be why taking a cold shower in the morning is good. So you got to think about that. Oxygen levels. So hypoxia with sleep disorder breathing, with poor breathing mechanics and breathing rate and habits and all that can actually compromise your body's circadian clock system. Changes within your gut microbiome. So you ever take antibiotics before, you notice you have issues with sleep or hormones, or you're not hungry, that could be part of that. The process of aging, alcohol consumption is another factor there. So it's important to understand all of the biological rhythms and so forth. So here, if you're interested in diving more into how temperature is a universal resetting cue for circadian clock oscillators, you might want to check out this seminal paper here that was published in the journal Science in 2010 by Ethan Burr. This is a really good article and heavily referenced. It's been referenced 750 times. Again, the title there is Temperature as a Universal Resetting Cue for Mammalian Circadian Clock Oscillators. Now, just to give you the punchline of what this paper found, and many other papers have since shown, is that in the morning, our body temperature is cooler, and then it starts to increase throughout the day. And so this may be why you're stronger later in the afternoon if you work out in the afternoon and so on, because your body temperature is a little bit higher. So we're going to get into this and talk all about this study from 2019 where they show that early time-restricted feeding improves 24-hour glucose levels and affects markers of circadian rhythms and also longevity. But first, I just want to welcome our new listeners back. I'm Mike Mutzel. Thank you as always for being here. Thank you for hitting that like button. If you're enjoying this content, please leave us a comment that tells the algorithms that this content was valuable to you. You got some information from that. That really helps us. And also what I'm going to do is put links to the show notes and some of the articles that we talk about that will be in the YouTube description and the iTunes description below. Now, as we continue on to talk a little bit more about how to optimize your feeding, fasting patterns, and sleep-wake cycles and all of that, a nutrient and a supplement that you may want to consider from our sister company, Myoscience, is berberine hydrochloride. This can be used to kickstart a prolonged fast. This can also be used, especially in the afternoon and evening, when a lot of people tend to have challenges and may need additional support for their healthy glucose metabolism. So you might want to consider berberine. I like to advise clients the only time you really don't want to take this is before you work out. So in the evening time, if you're prone to having snacks and cookies and you feel really hungry, berberine has a unique property in that it can increase levels of ketones. Ketones, as you know, can suppress appetite, can help curb some of those cravings, can help you feel full, which is what you want to do as you go to bed. So even individuals that I've worked with over years have found improvements in sleep and sleep quality when they take berberine. So you can save using the coupon code podcast on a really unique berberine stack that also features biotin and alpha-lipoic acid that works synergistically with berberine at the website myoscience.com. That's MYOXCIENCE.com. That's myoscience.com. Check out the berberine hydrochloride with ALA stack and use the coupon code podcast to save. You can take 1 or 2 caps in the afternoon. And again, you're kickstarting your fast. Hopefully after this conversation, you're starting your fast in the afternoon, late afternoon, early evening. So that's a great way to kind of reframe how you're fasting. So again, this was a seminal paper here in 2019 that found that early time-restricted feeding improves all sorts of aspects of longevity and aging. And here was the protocol. They matched individuals for energy intake. They had 3 meals a day in the intervention arm, which the feeding window was 8 in the morning, and they stopped eating at around 2:30. So they were fasting for 18 hours in a day. And the control arm, again, energy was equated for, but these individuals had 3 meals a day, 1 at 8 in the morning, 1 at around 2, and then 1 at around 8 o'clock at night. And so what you're seeing here is they were only fasting for 12 hours. So it's just a 6-hour difference. But again, we're controlling for the circadian biology. And what they showed, there was a statistical improvement in mean glucose levels, glycemic excursions and glucose excursions, as well as various aspects and genes regulating the circadian clock and circadian clock genes, longevity genes like genes linked with autophagy regulation, sirtuins, mTOR, and autophagy initiation protein. So this was a really important study. It's one to revisit because it was conducted really well by researchers at University of Alabama. And so there's also other recent studies. I'm just going to share with you some of the reference here. Increased risk of heart disease in night shift workers. So that was one study in the Lancet. Going back to 1986, adverse metabolic and cardiovascular consequences of circadian rhythm misalignment. This was a great article back in 2009 that was published. Simeon Panda has done a lot of work with early time restricted feeding just using a smartphone app, finding that just eating earlier in the day actually led to improvement in health benefits. And there was another study comparing intermittent fasting compared to continuous energy restriction on glycemic control in a randomized study. And let's see, there was another one here. So afternoon exercise is more efficacious than morning exercise at improving blood glucose levels in individuals with type 2 diabetes, a randomized crossover trial. So I thought that was interesting. So thinking about the timing and when you exercise, really important. This was a recently published study as well, the effect of time-restricted eating on body weight and fasting glucose in participants with obesity. Results of a randomized controlled virtual clinic trial. And this was published, I believe this was January of 2021, so earlier this year. So this had 78 randomized participants. They completed an 8-week study. And what they found is that people who were people that were obese who completed the study, and they were just doing a 14-10 window. So they were only fasting for 14 hours a day. So they had a 10-hour feeding window, which is a pretty big feeding window. And what they found is that the schedule combined with their sort of weight loss, low-calorie diet plan, that a fasting snack kind of program, there was a statistically significant and clinically meaningful weight loss and improvements in fasting blood glucose levels. So I think that's important. Again, trying to think about like, who is this for as we continue to talk about longevity. People that are overweight often, but not always, have blood sugar regulation issues, elevated levels of liver enzymes, and markers of insulin resistance. So if that's you, you may want to consider this early time-restricted feeding approach. Now, again, there's a lot of different ways to go about it. And as we continue on here to talk about how a prolonged overnight fast can extend lifespan and help to optimize the processes of longevity, namely autophagy, you might want to just think about starting your fast earlier. Cut off your feeding window at 6 p.m. Go for a walk. Some of the things that you can do to accelerate this fast is do some exercise in the afternoon, deplete that glycogen, squash that glucose, have a low-carb meal, maybe take some berberine, and start your fast early. Instead of this having cookies and snacks and eating dinner at 9, 10 p.m., that's not going to be optimal. especially for weight loss and blood sugar health, but also when it comes to longevity. And so here's the articles in Nature that really changed my perspective when it comes to reframing how we approach intermittent fasting and focusing more on time-restricted feeding. So a feeding schedule of prolonged overnight fasting periods extends healthy lifespan in fruit flies by promoting nighttime autophagy, a process in which material in cells is degraded and recycled. So here's a few images. This was a lay press version in review of the study that we're going to take a deep dive into right now, which I think is quite fascinating. So that study right here, the title of that I've shared with you earlier when we first started, but here it is again. Circadian autophagy drives time-restricted feeding mediated longevity. And so essentially, again, what they found, at least in fruit flies and other animals, is that the circadian clock system and autophagy are interconnected and woven together. They're impossible to disentangle. So if you're not getting the results that you want and you're fasting all day and you think, well, but I've fasted for 18 hours, so therefore my autophagy should be increased. Well, it's like, when were you fasting for those 18 hours? Was that during the middle of the day? Because what the study actually showed is that feeding fruit flies that have a diurnal rhythm very similar to ours, having them increase levels of autophagy during their active or daylight phase actually didn't enhance lifespan and health span. So it turns out that the process of autophagy may need to be increased during our not active phase or the dark cycle of our diurnal circadian clock and biologic rhythms, meaning that you want to be hitting your autophagy increases when you're sleeping. So that means you need to at least have been fasted for a little bit. That means you didn't have ice cream and cookies and a bunch of food right before going to bed. So that's a thing to consider. Now, as we talked about this time last year, you want to give yourself at least 6 hours between your last meal and the midpoint of your sleep. So for example, if you go to bed at, like most people, at 10 p.m. and wake up at maybe 6, your last meal should be at least 6 hours before 2 a.m. So just sort of think about that. Now, for people that are overweight, for people that have insulin resistance, for people that have cardiovascular related risk factors and metabolic syndrome parameters, I like to suggest at least 8 hours. That way, they're really getting into these processes of autophagy and having this metabolic switch where blood glucose starts to go down and fatty acid oxidation and ketones start to increase. So remember, 6 hours from your last meal or snack till the midpoint of sleep. That's ideal. Okay, so just sort of think about that. Try to think about, okay, if you go to bed at 11, that's fine. And you wake up at 6 or 7, then that means 3 o'clock. So just minus 6 hours from 3 o'clock, and you can sort of start to figure out. Now, to me, that's a little late. Having food at 8, 9 o'clock at night is pretty late. So on most days, you want to give yourself 6 to 8 hours between your last meal and the midpoint of sleep to optimize fat loss, weight loss, processes of autophagy, and much more. Okay, so in closing here, what these scientists actually found, that because both circadian regulation and autophagy are highly conserved processes, this work highlights that the possibility that behavioral or pharmaceutical interventions that stimulate circadian regulated autophagy might provide people with similar health benefits, such as delaying aging and optimizing lifespan extension and much more. So we cannot disentangle longevity-related pathways from the circadian clock system from our metabolic system. They are like three sides of the same sort of coin here. So we always want to think about, instead, for the 19th time, don't focus so much on how long you fast. Focus on when you are breaking your fast and when you are starting your fast. And try to start your fast earlier in the day. A mantra that I've shared with you since 2012 when we started making YouTube videos was eat early and sleep early. That is what so many athletes, so many healthy people that I've worked with over the years, and role models and bodybuilders and fitness people that stay lean and shredded. And it's not just about aesthetics, but overall health and supporting health span. Eat early, sleep early. Now, that doesn't mean you wake up at 6 in the morning and start crushing food. Go outside, move, get some natural sunlight, or even cloud cover in your eyes. Just going outside is important in the morning. Go for a walk with your dog or your kid or your cat, whatever. Get outside, help to entrain that body circadian clock system. Get a little cold, take a shower. That can help support your circadian clock system, which can help you have a good, better night's sleep. So that's another thing to consider. And then as you start to get hungry, maybe it's 8 for you, maybe it's 10, feed then, and then try to have an earlier dinner. I will note that, in our household, we do this and we try to eat around 5, 6 o'clock. My daughter's usually really hungry right after school. So we like to give her a meal, and that's and we'll sit down together and have a, that's not usually when we'll have our major meal, but we'll sit down together and hang out and stuff, and we'll have a little bit of food later. But that's been just a great way to help to support digestive health and sleep, and just pushing everything earlier seems to really help. So timing is everything, friends. That's it for today. I'm grateful that you tuned all the way in. Hopefully you got some value out of this, and you can reframe how you approach intermittent fasting to then consider your body's circadian clock system, because these are impossible to disentangle. They are two parts of the same coin, and they're interconnected and regulate and feedback each other. What I will do is link all the articles in the show notes, and also the video version of this if you want to go back and check out some of those images. I hope you have an awesome rest of your day. I'm grateful that you tuned in all the way. Thanks for hitting that like button. Thanks for leaving a comment, and we will catch you on a future podcast down the road. Have a good one. Bye now.